Amelia's charade crumbled in a scene of public humiliation. Ricardo confronted her with the recordings, Veritas's voice repeating, "I'm hungry," like an accusatory chorus. Amelia, pale and speechless, watched her life of luxury collapse. Expelled from the mansion without a penny, she lost everything. Mr. Elias was rescued, showered with care and affection, and Veritas, the messenger of truth, received his place of honor, living proof that sometimes the most unexpected voice is the one that reveals the cruelest of realities. The cold street was her new home, and the asphalt her pillow. The silk of her dress, now crumpled, dirty, and torn at one shoulder, seemed a mockery against her skin, bristling from the icy wind. Amelia, once the queen of the mansion, was barefoot, lost, with her world collapsing with each uncertain step, each scornful glance she received from hurried passers-by. The humiliation burned more than the night's cold, more than the hunger that began to gnaw at her stomach. Veritas's voice, repeating, "I'm hungry," echoed in her mind, not as an accusation, but as a mocking song, an infernal melody that taunted her downfall. How could a parrot, a simple bird, destroy everything? The question hammered in her head, feeding a bubbling rage, a hot venom in her veins that promised not to dissipate. She was not a victim. She was a survivor, and they would pay. Ricardo, the blind fool who preferred to believe an animal over her, his wife, and Elias, the dying old man who dared to defy her, who refused to die in silence, and Veritas. Oh, Veritas. That bird would be the first to feel her fury if she had the chance. The night advanced, and with it the certainty that there was nowhere to go. Without money, without contacts, without a single true friend who wasn't interested in her status, Amelia was alone. The image of the mansion, the jewels, the designer clothes, everything she considered hers by right, played like a film in her mind, each scene a dagger to her pride. But at the bottom of that abyss of despair, a spark of malice ignited. It wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new game, a game where the rules would be hers and revenge the only currency. She would rise from the ashes, and when she did, Ricardo's family would feel the weight of her wrath. The expulsion was just the first act. The real drama was yet to come. While Amelia lost herself in the city's shadows, at the mansion, the silence was heavy, different from the previous emptiness. It was a silence of guilt, of regret, of open wounds that were barely beginning to heal. Ricardo walked through the corridors, every luxury, every art object, a vivid reminder of his blindness, of his negligence. How could he not see? How could he trust someone so cruel, so deceitful? The image of his father, Elias, wasting away in the tool shed with only water, was a ghost that haunted him, an indelible stain on his conscience. His father was in the main bedroom, under the care of private nurses and doctors, but his body was recovering faster than his soul. The old man's eyes still carried the terror of the shed, the shadow of hunger and thirst, the dread of loneliness and abandonment. Ricardo tried to approach, to offer comfort, but the barrier between them was palpable, an abyss of betrayal and negligence that he had inadvertently dug. Elias accepted the care, but trust, which had been shattered into 1,000 pieces, would take time to rebuild, if it ever would. Ricardo's words of apologies and promises seemed empty in the face of the suffering his father had endured. Veritas, perched on his golden perch, observed everything with his intelligent eyes, a silent guardian, the living memory of a painful truth that no one in the house dared to forget. His presence, once an exotic curiosity, was now a constant reminder of the fragility of truth and the insidious nature of evil. The parrot, the unlikely messenger, had saved a life, but the scar left by Amelia's cruelty was deep, not just on Elias, but on the entire family structure. The police had been notified, and a lawsuit against Amelia for mistreatment and attempted murder was underway. But for Ricardo, legal justice seemed a distant formality. The real battle was internal, the struggle to forgive himself, to heal his father's wounds, and to rebuild what remained of his family. He knew Amelia had been expelled, stripped of everything, but the feeling that she still loomed as an invisible threat was a heavy burden. The peace in the mansion was fragile, built on the ruins of betrayal, and the future uncertain. Amelia's story of her downfall and her thirst for revenge was only beginning to be written in the shadows. The cold street was not just a place, it was a purgatory, a baptism by fire for Amelia. The initial shock of expulsion had transformed into a furnace of resentment, a fury that ironically kept her warm, even as the city's breath turned to ice. She walked, at first aimlessly, then with a purpose born of the purest despair. The silk dress, once a symbol of her power, was now a tattered banner of her downfall. But the fall, she swore, was merely a prelude. Her first night was a blur of dark alleys, the nauseating smell of garbage, and the terrifying anonymity of the streets. She quickly learned that beauty and charm, her most potent weapons in the gilded cages of high society, were useless there. In that underworld, only cunning and cruelty guaranteed survival. She observed, she listened, she saw the homeless, the desperate, and a flash of recognition ignited within her. They were survivors, just as she intended to be. She found an abandoned building, a forgotten skeleton of bricks and broken glass, a temporary sanctuary against the biting wind. Her stomach rumbled, a constant and painful reminder of Veritas's mocking cry, "I'm hungry." The words echoed not just in her mind, but in the very air around her, a phantom torturer. But hunger also sharpened her senses, honed her determination. She would not just survive, she would thrive again. And her resurgence would be built on the ashes of their complacency. She needed money, a phone, a way to blend in. The silk dress was a beacon, marking her as an easy target or a fallen trophy. She found a dumpster behind a charity shop, a treasure trove of discarded lives. A pair of worn jeans, a faded hoodie, a pair of sneakers. Nothing elegant, but practical. She stripped off the silk, feeling a strange sense of liberation as the last vestige of her old life fell away. It was a disguise, yes, but also a uniform for her new war. Her plan began to form, not as a grand scheme, but as a series of small, poisonous steps. First, information. She needed to know what was happening in her mansion, who visited Elias, what were Ricardo's movements, the legal proceedings. What were the police doing? She remembered the gossip, the network of servants and drivers, the petty jealousies she had once scorned. Now, these could be her eyes and ears. Her first target, an old contact, a driver she had fired for insubordination, but who had always been a source of gossip. He frequented a specific bar on the outskirts of the city. It was a long walk, but the cold and hunger were her fuel. She arrived, a ghost in the shadows observing. He was there, drinking a beer, oblivious. She approached him, her voice low, a whisper of her old self, tempered with a new and dangerous intensity. "Carlos," she began, "I need a favor, and you owe me one." The look in his eyes was a mixture of surprise, fear, and a flicker of something she recognized: greed. She had nothing to offer but a promise of future reward and the implicit threat of her own desperation. It was enough. Carlos, she knew, was a rat, but even rats had their uses. He would be her first pawn. At the mansion, the silence was a heavier burden than any scream. Ricardo felt like a stranger in his own home. Every room, every object, seemed imbued with a painful memory. The office, where Amelia used to laugh at his jokes, the dining room, where she orchestrated luxurious dinners, even the garden, where she strolled with calculated grace. Everything now was a reminder of her charade. He tried to focus on work, on the company's finances, but his mind wandered to his father's room. Elias, in turn, was trapped in his own cell of memory. Nurses reported that he refused to eat certain foods, perhaps associating them with the imposed scarcity. He asked for water with an almost obsessive frequency, as if he still feared thirst. Ricardo tried to sit at the table with him, but Elias ate little, his eyes fixed on a distant point, as if reliving the days of confinement. With each of Ricardo's attempts to break the ice, to talk about the future, about recovery, Elias responded with an empty gaze, a nod. Trust, like a broken crystal vase, seemed impossible to mend. "Father, I'm so sorry," Ricardo repeated, the words sounding hollow even to himself. How could he apologize for such blindness, for having allowed the woman he loved to turn his father into a prisoner, into a specter of himself? The nurses and doctors assured him that physical recovery was remarkable, but psychological recovery would be a long and tortuous path. Elias had nightmares, woke up in a cold sweat, eyes wide, mumbling about darkness and thirst. Ricardo saw everything, and each scene was a dagger in his heart. Veritas, oblivious to human complexity, remained on his perch, a point of light and truth amidst the darkness. He still chirped, still repeated random phrases, but "I'm hungry" had disappeared from his repertoire, as if the truth once spoken no longer needed to be repeated. He watched Ricardo with his sharp eyes, and Ricardo at times felt that the bird judged him, that it knew of his blindness, of his failure. It was a constant reminder, a silent guardian of the truth he had taken so long to accept. The police proceeded with the case against Amelia, but the news seemed distant, unreal. Legal justice would not bring back lost time, broken trust. The feeling that Amelia had not simply disappeared, but had transformed into a latent threat, began to erode Ricardo's already fragile peace. He reinforced the mansion's security, installed new cameras, hired more guards, but the paranoia did not come from an obvious physical threat. It came from a premonition, from the certainty that Amelia's malice was a fire that would not be extinguished by a simple expulsion. He knew she was cunning, vengeful, and that, somewhere in the city's shadows, she was plotting. The night brought not only silence, but also the whisper of a revenge that was approaching, slow and inexorable. Amelia's voice, a cold and calculated whisper, pierced Carlos's alcoholic haze like an ice needle. "Carlos," she repeated, her hand lightly resting on his arm, a caress that promised as much as it threatened. He shivered, not just from the unexpected touch, but from the sight of her. The woman he had known, always impeccable, was now wrapped in shabby clothes, but her eyes, those eyes still shone with dangerous intensity. Fear mingled with curiosity and, yes, greed. Amelia had nothing, but the aura of power she exuded, even in disgrace, was undeniable. "You owe me one," she continued, the phrase hanging between them like an ancient unpaid debt. Carlos remembered the dismissal, the public humiliation. He hated her, but he also feared her, and deep down there was a pang of admiration for her audacity. "I know everything," she lied, her voice low. "I know about your little deals, your debts. But I also know you're smart, and that you know how things work over there." She made a vague gesture towards the mansion, a distant shadow in the night. Carlos hesitated, clearing his throat. "What do you want, Amelia?" "Information," she replied, without beating around the bush. "I want to know about the house, about Elias, about Ricardo, every visit, every movement, every word you hear, and about the lawsuit, the police. What are they saying?" She promised a reward, a future where he would be well rewarded for his loyalty. But the real currency was fear, the seed of revenge she planted in his heart. Carlos, a man of small ambitions and great fears, was the weak link she needed. He agreed reluctantly with the promise of a future payment he knew might never come, but with the certainty that refusing would be far more dangerous. Amelia smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The first pawn was in play. At the mansion, Ricardo's paranoia intensified daily. Security had been tripled. High-definition cameras monitored every inch of the perimeter, motion sensors protected the gardens, and additional guards patrolled the property day and night. But the feeling of being under surveillance, that Amelia was a shadow hanging over them, did not diminish. He felt like a general in a besieged castle. But the enemy was invisible, and the battlefield, his own mind. He spent hours in the office, his eyes fixed on the security monitors, looking for any anomaly, any sign of his ex-wife. Every falling leaf, every moving shadow was a trigger for his anxiety. Guilt gnawed at him, an open wound that refused to heal. How could he have been so blind, so naive? The image of Elias, wasting away in the shed, was a film that repeated incessantly in his mind, an endless torture. Elias, in turn, continued his slow and painful recovery. Physically, he gained strength, but his soul remained captive. Nightmares were frequent, muffled screams echoed in the room during the night, and nurses reported that he woke up in a panic, eyes wide, searching for something in the darkness. He still asked for water with distressing frequency, as if the thirst of days past still tormented him. Food was a challenge. He ate minimal portions, often refusing dishes he once enjoyed, as if the taste of abundance was an affront to the memory of scarcity. Ricardo tried to approach, sat by the bed, read to him, talked about the future. But Elias's eyes remained distant, empty, as if his son's presence was a painful reminder of his betrayal. "Father, please forgive me," Ricardo pleaded, the words a hollow echo in the vastness of the room. But forgiveness was not something that could be given or received so easily. It was a bridge that had been dynamited, and rebuilding it seemed an impossible task. Veritas, oblivious to the complexity of human suffering, remained on his golden perch, a vibrant splash of color amidst the melancholy. He observed everything with his intelligent eyes, tilting his head, sometimes letting out a sharp chirp. "Good morning," he would say, or "what a beautiful day." Phrases that seemed mocking in the face of the darkness enveloping the house. Ricardo, at times, felt that the parrot judged him, that it saw the truth of his failure, of his blindness. Veritas was a mirror, a constant reminder of the truth he had taken so long to accept, and his presence, once a curiosity, was now a burden. News of the lawsuit against Amelia arrived, but it seemed distant, bureaucratic. Legal justice was an abstraction, incapable of healing real wounds, of filling the void left by broken trust. Ricardo knew Amelia had been stripped of everything, but the feeling that she still existed, that she was plotting, was a slow poison that consumed him. He felt it in his bones, in every lengthening shadow, in every whisper of the wind. Meanwhile, Amelia, in the city's shadows, received the first information from Carlos. The guards' schedules, Elias's habits, Ricardo's routine. A new and dangerous plan began to form in her mind. She didn't just want revenge, she wanted total destruction, the annihilation of the peace they were desperately trying to rebuild. The mansion, once her paradise, would be their hell, and she would be the architect. Night fell over the city, and with it the certainty that the calm was merely a prelude. Ricardo, alone in his office, looked at the monitors, but his eyes saw only Amelia's face, a cold smile, a promise of chaos. Revenge, he knew, was a dish best served cold, and Amelia had all the patience in the world. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The mansion, once a sanctuary of luxury and apparent happiness, had become a besieged fortress, not by visible enemies, but by the shadows of Ricardo's mind. Each day was a battle against paranoia, a struggle to discern reality from the illusion that Amelia, even absent, seemed to weave around him. He felt like a prisoner in his own home, his eyes fixed on the security monitors, searching for a threat that never openly manifested, but that he felt in every fiber of his being. Guilt was a slow poison, corroding his peace, transforming his sleep into a nightmare battlefield where Elias's emaciated and terrified face haunted him. Elias, in turn, continued his arduous journey of recovery. Physically, progress was notable, a testament to the resilience of the human body, but the mind, that fragile fortress, remained in ruins. Nightmares were constant, muffled screams echoing through the corridors, a grim reminder of the terror he had endured. He woke in a panic, eyes wide, hand outstretched in the dark, searching for the water that had once been denied him. The obsession with hydration was palpable. He asked for water with distressing frequency, as if the thirst of days past still pursued him. Food was a challenge, each mouthful a reminder of scarcity, of humiliation. Ricardo tried to approach, read to him, spoke about the future, about rebuilding their lives, but Elias's eyes remained distant, empty, his son's presence a painful reminder of a betrayal he couldn't forgive, perhaps not even comprehend. Forgiveness was a dynamited bridge, and Ricardo felt the impossibility of rebuilding it. Veritas, oblivious to the complexity of human suffering, observed everything from his golden perch. His keen eyes followed Ricardo, Elias, the nurses, the guards. He still uttered his random phrases, "Good morning, what a beautiful day." But now, occasionally a new sound escaped his beak. A dry cough, followed by an almost inaudible whisper, "Water, water." Ricardo shivered the first time he heard it. It was Amelia's voice, imitated with terrifying perfection, the same voice the Parrot had recorded, the same voice that had condemned his father. Veritas's presence, once a reminder of the truth, was now a torment, a constant echo of Amelia's cruelty. While the mansion sank into its own version of hell, Amelia, in the city's shadows, received information from Carlos. The former security guard, a man of small ambitions and great fears, was the perfect link for her plan of destruction. He reported the guard's schedules, Elias's habits, Ricardo's routine. Every detail was a piece in Amelia's revenge puzzle, a map for the annihilation of the peace they were desperately trying to rebuild. "Is he broken, Carlos?" Amelia asked, her voice cold as ice, her eyes gleaming with sick satisfaction. "Ricardo? Yes, madam. He doesn't sleep well. He keeps looking at the cameras. He looks like a ghost," Carlos replied, his voice choked with fear and the excitement of his new role. "And the old man?" she inquired, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Mr. Elias. He still asks for water. He has nightmares. He doesn't talk much. The nurses say it's the trauma." "Excellent," Amelia murmured, the word laden with subtle poison. "Now I want you to do something for me, something small but significant." Amelia's instructions were precise, calculated to sow doubt and paranoia. Carlos was to, at specific moments, deactivate a camera for a few minutes, just enough to create a glitch in the security system. He was to move Ricardo's small personal objects, a book, a wristwatch, a photo frame, from one place to another, subtly, so that Ricardo would question his own memory, his sanity. And, cruelest of all, he was to ensure that, occasionally, the light in Elias's room flickered in a specific way, or that the sound of a dripping faucet was audible, echoes of the darkness and thirst that had tormented him. Carlos, with trembling hands, carried out the orders. The first deactivated camera made Ricardo's heart pound. He reviewed the footage, looking for the glitch, but found nothing. Just a lapse, a system error. Then the book he had left on the bedside table appeared on the office desk. The watch, which he was sure he had left in the bathroom, was in the kitchen. Small anomalies, but they accumulated, creating a web of uncertainty. Ricardo began to doubt himself, his memory, his ability to protect his father and his home. Paranoia transformed into constant anxiety, an incessant hum in his mind. He spent sleepless nights, walking the corridors, checking doors and windows, his eyes fixed on the shadows, waiting for the inevitable. In Elias's room, the effects were even more devastating. The intermittent flickering of the light, the sound of the dripping faucet in the adjacent bathroom, were triggers that took him back to the dark, damp shed. His nocturnal screams intensified, and nurses reported that he woke in even greater panic, eyes wide, mumbling about the darkness and insatiable thirst. Ricardo saw his father's deterioration, the regression, and guilt consumed him even more. He felt powerless, unable to protect Elias from a threat that seemed invisible, but was clearly operating within his own home. Veritas, on his perch, watched the chaos unfold. The Parrot, once a simple messenger of truth, now seemed a silent accomplice, a mirror of the madness Amelia was orchestrating. His chirps and random phrases seemed to mock the situation, but the cough and the whisper, "Water, water," were a constant reminder of the origin of all suffering. Ricardo, at times, felt that the bird judged him, that it knew the truth behind every security flaw, every moved object. The Parrot was a guardian of truth, and that truth was a burden too heavy for Ricardo to bear. News of the lawsuit against Amelia was just a distant noise, a legal formality that didn't touch the reality of his torment. Justice, he realized, was slow and blind, unable to stop the true threat Amelia represented. She didn't just want freedom. She wanted the destruction of everything he loved, everything he was trying to rebuild. The mansion, once his home, was now a psychological battlefield, and Amelia, the architect of chaos, was just beginning. Night fell, and with it the certainty that the calm was just a prelude to the next wave of her invisible attack. Ricardo was trapped in a web of paranoia, and Amelia in the shadows pulled the strings. The game was far from over. It was only intensifying. The calm never came. Night dissolved into a grey dawn, and with it, the certainty that Amelia's web tightened with each passing hour. Days dragged on, heavy and indistinct, a blur of anxiety and sleep deprivation for Ricardo. His eyes, once alert, were now deep wells of exhaustion, his eyelids heavy, his skin pale, and stretched over the prominent bones of his face. He barely ate, living on coffee and the adrenaline pumping through his veins, keeping him in a constant state of alert, of silent panic. The small anomalies, once subtle, became a dissonant symphony of torment. The wristwatch, which he swore he had left on the bedside table, appeared at the bottom of the sock drawer. His reading glasses, which he wore until he fell asleep, were found in the bathroom, on the sink, as if someone had deliberately left them there. He started recording everything, taking photos, writing notes, desperate to prove to himself that he wasn't going mad. But the evidence was ephemeral, easily dismissed as memory lapses or stress. The mansion, once a refuge, transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Ricardo installed more cameras, but they seemed to have a life of their own, a momentary power failure, a frozen pixel, a blind spot that appeared out of nowhere. He spent hours reviewing the recordings, his eyes bloodshot, searching for the ghost that lurked in his house. With each glitch, each moved object, the poison of doubt deepened, corroding his sanity. He saw Amelia in every shadow, felt her presence in every draft, her cold smile in every silence. Elias, in turn, sank deeper into his own hell. Amelia's triggers were cruel and precise. The bedroom lights flickered with disturbing frequency. not just at night, but during the day, simulating the darkness of the shed. The sound of a dripping faucet, once sporadic, was now almost constant, a slow, relentless drip that echoed in Elias's ears, reminding him of his insatiable thirst. He refused to eat unless Ricardo fed him, and even then, each mouthful was a struggle. His nocturnal screams grew sharper, more desperate, and nurses reported that he spent hours huddled in the corner of the room, mumbling about the darkness and the thirst. The obsession with water was palpable. He asked for it every few minutes, his voice hoarse, his eyes wide with panic. Ricardo tried to calm him, held his hand, but Elias's eyes remained distant, empty. His son's presence a painful reminder of a betrayal he couldn't forgive. Veritas, on his golden perch, was the constant herald of truth and torment. The parrot, once a curiosity, now seemed a tormentor, a mirror of the madness Amelia orchestrated. His chirps and random phrases seemed to mock the situation, but the dry cough and the whisper, "Water, water," were a constant reminder of the origin of all suffering. The sound of Amelia's voice, imitated with terrifying perfection, echoed through the corridors, haunting Ricardo. He felt that the bird judged him, that it knew the truth behind every security flaw, every moved object. In a moment of despair, Ricardo even yelled at Veritas, demanding that he stop, that he be silent. But the parrot merely tilted its head, chirped, "Good morning," and then the cough and the icy whisper, "Water, water." Amelia, in the city's shadows, received Carlos's reports with almost palpable pleasure. "He's at his limit, madam. He barely sleeps, talks to himself, argues with the parrot," Carlos reported, his voice choked with fear and the excitement of his new role. "Excellent," Amelia murmured, her eyes gleaming with sick satisfaction. "And the old man?" "Mr. Elias. He's getting worse. The doctors are worried. He doesn't respond, just asks for water." A cruel smile played on Amelia's lips. "Perfect. Now, Carlos, it's time to tighten the noose. I want him to start doubting not just his sanity, but his freedom." Ricardo felt the noose tightening. Elias's doctors began to question his ability to manage his father's care. The nurses looked at him with suspicion, whispering in corners. He tried to explain, tried to show his notes, the photos, but his voice sounded desperate, his arguments incoherent. Paranoia was transforming him into the monster Amelia wanted him to be. He felt like a prisoner in his own home, his eyes fixed on the security monitors, searching for a threat that never openly manifested, but that he felt in every fiber of his being. Then came the most direct blow. A nurse, with a look of pity mixed with judgment, informed him that social services had been contacted. "An anonymous complaint," she said, "about Elias's neglect and Ricardo's erratic behavior." The word guardianship was whispered, and Ricardo felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. It was no longer just his sanity at stake, but his ability to protect his father, to keep his family together. Amelia didn't just want to see him go mad. She wanted to strip him of everything, even his own identity. Night fell over the city, and with it, the certainty that the calm was merely a prelude to the next wave of her invisible attack. Ricardo was trapped in a web of paranoia, and Amelia, in the shadows, pulled the strings. The game was far from over. It was only intensifying, and with each passing day, Ricardo felt he was losing more than just his peace. He was losing his mind, and now perhaps his freedom. The word guardianship echoed in Ricardo's mind like a gunshot, shattering what remained of his fragile sanity. It was no longer a matter of proving he wasn't mad. It was a battle not to lose everything. His ability to care for his father, the very essence of his responsibility, was being questioned. Amelia didn't just want to see him collapse. She wanted to strip him of his identity, of his purpose. The night that followed that revelation was the longest of his life, a purgatory of racing thoughts and concrete fears. The following days were a whirlwind. Social services acted with frightening swiftness. A social worker, Ms. Lucia, a woman with a serious demeanor and scrutinizing eyes, visited the mansion. Her presence was a constant reminder of the sword hanging over Ricardo's head. She observed every movement, every interaction with Elias, every detail of the house. The questions were incisive, formulated with a professional coolness that Ricardo interpreted as judgment. "Where is Mr. Elias's medication, Mr. Ricardo? We have a report indicating it was forgotten on 2 occasions." Ricardo tried to explain. His voice choked, pointing to the meticulously organized medicine boxes, but Miss Lucia merely took notes, her gaze fixed on his agitation. "And the medical report detailing the need for constant hydration. It wasn't found in the file." Ricardo felt a chill. He remembered having personally delivered that report. Carlos's evidence, planted with surgical precision, was coming to light, and Ricardo's every attempt at defense only made him seem more guilty, more unbalanced. He stammered, his hands trembled, and Ms. Lucia observed everything with disturbing calm. The nurses, once merely suspicious, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and repulsion. Their whispers became more audible, the words unstable and neglect floating in the air like a miasma. Ricardo felt like an outcast in his own home. Every glance a dart, every silence an accusation. He tried to maintain composure, but sleep deprivation and constant pressure were taking their toll. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale, and he could barely form coherent sentences. Elias, oblivious to the legal storm brewing, sank deeper into his own nightmare. His nocturnal screams grew more frequent, sharper. He refused to leave the room, huddled in the corner, eyes wide, mumbling about the darkness and the thirst. The obsession with water was almost palpable. He asked for it every few minutes, his voice hoarse, his lips cracked. Ricardo tried to calm him, offering him water, but Elias recoiled, his eyes distant, his mind trapped in some dark, damp shed. Miss Lucia witnessed one such scene, and the expression on her face left no doubt. She saw a sick man being neglected by an unbalanced son. Veritas, the parrot, became a cruel herald of truth and torment. His chirps and random phrases seemed to mock Ricardo, but the dry cough and the whisper, "Water, water," were a constant reminder of the origin of all suffering. The sound of Amelia's voice, imitated with terrifying perfection, echoed through the corridors, haunting Ricardo. "Good morning," Veritas would say, and then in Amelia's voice, "He's at his limit, madam. He barely sleeps, talks to himself, argues with the parrot." Miss Lucia heard the parrot, and Ricardo saw the note in her pad. Erratic behavior. Auditory hallucinations, voice of deceased wife, arguments with pet. Amelia's new instructions were diabolical. Carlos was to accidentally leave the recording of Ricardo yelling at Veritas in a place where Ms. Lucia could find it, perhaps near the defective security monitors. And the fake will, an old draft, but one that looked convincing, was to be discovered in one of Ricardo's books, as if he were studying it. The objective was clear, not just to isolate Ricardo, but to incriminate him, transforming his paranoia into evidence of a Machiavellian plan. Ricardo felt he was losing control not just of his mind, but of his own narrative. He was the villain in a story that wasn't his, a monster created by Amelia's malice. Ms. Lucia scheduled a preliminary hearing for the following week. The word guardianship was now a sentence, not just a whisper. He was trapped in a web of lies and manipulations, and Amelia, in the shadows, pulled the strings with cruel mastery. With each passing day, Ricardo felt he was losing more than just his peace. He was losing his mind, his freedom, and now, perhaps, his own dignity. The game was far from over, but Ricardo felt he was about to lose everything. The word guardianship was no longer a distant whisper, but a deafening scream in Ricardo's mind. a sentence pronounced even before the trial. It was not just his sanity at stake, but his very identity, his ability to be a son, to be a guardian. The night that followed that revelation was a purgatory. Every shadow a demon, every silence an echo of the accumulating accusations. Sleep, a long-forgotten luxury, now seemed a cruel mirage, replaced by a feverish state of wakefulness, where reality and nightmare merged in a macabre dance. The days that followed were a whirlwind of bureaucracy and despair. Ms. Lucia, the social worker with a serious demeanor and scrutinizing eyes, returned to the mansion. Her presence a constant reminder of the sword hanging over Ricardo's head. She wasn't there to investigate, but to confirm. Every movement of Ricardo was scrutinized, every word dissected. He tried to maintain composure, but sleep deprivation and constant pressure were taking their toll. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale, and he could barely form coherent sentences. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a prison, each room a stage for the charade Amelia orchestrated. Ricardo felt the nurse's gazes, now not just suspicious, but openly accusatory. The whispers became more audible, the words unstable, neglect, and dangerous, floating in the air like a toxic miasma. He felt like an outcast in his own home, every glance a dart, every silence an accusation. The trap was set, and Ricardo, exhausted and desperate, walked blindly into it. During one of Ms. Lucia's visits, as she inspected Ricardo's office, Carlos, Amelia's loyal butler, executed the first part of the plan. He accidentally knocked over a pile of papers near the defective security monitors in the living room. As he bent down to pick them up, he found a small digital recorder, conveniently on and with the volume low, but audible enough for anyone nearby. "Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Lucia. I don't know how this got here," Carlos said with feigned surprise. Ms. Lucia, curious, picked up the device. As she pressed play, Ricardo's voice, distorted by anger and despair, filled the silent room. "Veritas, shut up! I swear to God, if you don't stop that, I'll strangle you." And then the dry cough and the parrot's icy whisper, "Water, water." Ms. Lucia listened to the recording with a growing expression of horror, her eyes fixed on Ricardo, who was paralyzed. He tried to explain, but the words tangled in his throat. The image of an unbalanced man threatening a defenseless animal was undeniable. Miss Lucia's pen scribbled furiously in her pad. The final blow came shortly after. As Ms. Lucia continued her inspection, this time in Ricardo's library, Carlos, with an expression of forced concern, pointed to an old book Ricardo had left open on his study desk. "Mr. Ricardo has been studying a lot about succession law lately, Ms. Lucia. He's very concerned about Mr. Elias's future." Ms. Lucia, her curiosity piqued, approached the desk. Between the pages of the book, carefully folded to appear forgotten there, was a document, a draft will, unsigned but with Elias's name at the top, and handwriting mimicking Ricardo's in some marginal notes. The will's content was devastating. Ricardo was named the sole beneficiary of Elias's entire fortune, with an explicit clause disinheriting Elias if he were declared legally incapable of managing his own assets and care. Ms. Lucia read every word, her face becoming a mask of repulsion. She looked at Ricardo, who watched the scene as if in a nightmare. The play was complete. It wasn't just neglect or instability, it was a plan. A Machiavellian plan to seize his father's fortune, using his illness as a pretext. Ricardo felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Amelia's web of lies and manipulations had not only isolated him, but had incriminated him. He was the villain in a story that wasn't his, a monster created by the malice of a woman he once loved. Ms. Lucia scheduled the preliminary hearing for the following week. The word guardianship was now a sentence, not just a whisper. He was trapped in a web of lies and manipulations, and Amelia, in the city's shadows, pulled the strings with cruel mastery, savoring every moment of Ricardo's downfall. That night, Ricardo didn't sleep. He sat in the darkness, looking at Veritas, who slept peacefully on his perch. The parrot, the only link to the truth, was also the instrument of his ruin. He was losing more than his peace, his mind, his freedom. He was losing his own dignity, his honor, everything he was. The game was far from over, but Ricardo felt he was about to lose everything. The hearing was approaching, and with it, the certainty that his world, already in ruins, would be completely pulverized. Morning arrived, not as a new day, but as the last dawn of his life as he knew it. Ricardo didn't see it born. He felt it, like an icy weight dragging itself across the window, invading the dark room where he had remained motionless since the previous night. Silence was the only witness to his agony, a heavy, almost deafening silence that seemed to swallow any remnant of hope. Veritas, on his perch, slept, a small patch of vibrant colors in the gloom, oblivious to the storm that would engulf his owner. The parrot, which should have been the key to his salvation, was now the seal of his condemnation. Carlos, with his cruel punctuality, knocked on the door. It wasn't an invitation, but a summons. "Mr. Ricardo, Miss Lucia is waiting. The car is ready." The butler's voice, once respectful, now carried a tone of cold formality, Amelia's mask of loyalty fully assumed. Ricardo stood up, his muscles stiff, his body heavy as lead. Every movement was an effort, every breath a reminder of the suffocation he felt. He looked at himself in the mirror. A stranger stared back, with deep, bloodshot eyes, unshaven, his face pale and marked by an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. It was the image of a broken man, a specter of what he once was. The journey to the courthouse was a blur. The city passed by the car windows, indifferent to his ruin. Hurried people, honking cars, the hum of daily life. Everything seemed distant, unreal. He was a man in a bubble of despair, being led to slaughter. The driver, a man he had known for years, avoided his gaze, his posture rigid, the silence heavy. Even the air inside the car seemed charged with judgment. The courthouse building rose, imposing and cold, a fortress of laws and judgments. Upon entering, the smell of old paper and formality hit him. Corridors echoed, voices whispered, and every pair of eyes that met his seemed to carry the same silent condemnation that already inhabited his mind. He was the villain, the monster, the ungrateful son who tried to seize his father's fortune. Amelia's narrative had taken root, and now he reaped the bitter fruits of her sowing. In the waiting room, Miss Lucia was already present, sitting upright, her face a mask of seriousness. She didn't greet him, merely cast him a penetrating glance, a mixture of pity and repulsion, which made Ricardo shrink internally. His lawyers, appointed by Miss Lucia herself to ensure the impartiality of the process, tried to approach him, but their words were mere buzzing amidst the chaos of his mind. He couldn't concentrate, couldn't formulate a defense, couldn't even breathe deeply. The door opened, and the call for the preliminary hearing resonated. Ricardo's heart hammered in his chest, a war drum announcing his defeat. The courtroom was cold and formal, with the judge seated on his elevated platform, the personification of authority and law. On the other side of the room, Amelia was not present, but her impeccably dressed lawyers smiled discreetly, confidence overflowing in their gestures. Her absence was, in itself, proof of her mastery. She didn't need to be there to witness her victory. Ms. Lucia began to present the case, her voice clear and concise, each word a direct hit. She described Elias's condition, the neglect, the deprivation of water, the isolation. Ricardo felt a knot in his throat. He tried to speak, tried to interrupt, but was silenced by his own lawyer, who advised him to remain calm. How could he remain calm when his life was being dismantled before his eyes? Then came the recording. The small digital recorder was connected to a sound system, and Ricardo's voice, distorted by anger and despair, filled the room. "Veritas, shut up. I swear to God, if you don't stop that, I'll strangle you." And then the dry cough and the parrot's icy whisper. "Water. Water." The room fell silent. Ricardo saw the looks of horror, the murmurs spreading like wildfire. He was the unbalanced man, the aggressor of a defenseless animal, the torturer of his own father. Next, the draft will. The document was displayed, its marginal notes, the handwriting mimicking his own, the clause that made him the sole beneficiary if Elias were declared incapacitated. A meticulous plan, Ms. Lucia concluded, to seize Mr. Elias's fortune, using his condition as a pretext. The word Machiavellian hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. Ricardo felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Words tangled in his throat. The truth seemed a distant, unreachable mirage. He was a man drowning in lies, and every attempt to defend himself only pulled him deeper. He looked at the judge, at the lawyers, at Ms. Lucia, seeking a glimpse of understanding, of humanity. But he only found looks of condemnation, of distrust. Amelia's web was perfect. She had not only incriminated him, but had stripped him of his voice, his sanity, his very identity. He was the villain in a story that wasn't his, a monster created by the malice of a woman he once loved. The hearing was not a search for justice. It was a formality, the execution of a sentence already pronounced. Ricardo was losing everything, and with every word uttered in that courtroom, his world, already in ruins, was pulverized into dust. The game was far from over, but he knew with chilling certainty that he had already lost. The silence that followed the playback of the recording was not one of respect, but of horror. It was a heavy silence, laden with judgment, that infiltrated every fiber of my being. I could feel the gazes, the minds working, constructing the image of the monster Amelia had so meticulously painted. The parrot's voice, that dry cough, the icy whisper of water. Water was no longer Elias's confession, but proof of my cruelty, the soundtrack of my downfall. My own voice, distorted by anger and despair, echoed in the room, a forced confession, a perfect trap. "Veritas, shut up. I swear to God, if you don't stop that, I'll strangle you." The words, torn from me in a moment of pure agony, were now the rope that hanged me. No one there seemed to understand that that anger wasn't directed at the bird, but at the truth it spat out, at the powerlessness of not being able to prove what it truly meant. It was the anger of a cornered man, not an aggressor. But how to explain that now? Ms. Lucia, with her impassive voice, broke the silence. "As we have heard, Your Honor, Mr. Ricardo demonstrates erratic and violent behavior, going so far as to threaten a defenseless animal, which is, ironically, his father's only companion." She paused dramatically, allowing her words to sink in, for the poison to spread. "Is this the man who proposes to care for a frail elder? I tried to speak, tried to shout, but my lawyer, a man hired by Amelia, and therefore a silent accomplice, held my arm firmly. "Calm down, Mr. Ricardo. It's not the time." It wasn't the time. My life was being dismantled, my reputation pulverized, and he asked me to be calm. The irony was a punch to the gut. Next, the draft will. The document displayed on a large screen with my supposed marginal notes, the handwriting mimicking mine, the clause that made me the sole beneficiary if Elias were declared incapacitated. It was a masterpiece of forgery, a masterstroke in the art of betrayal. "A meticulous plan," Ms. Lucia concluded, her voice laden with calculated indignation, "to seize Mr. Elias's fortune, using his condition as a pretext." The word Machiavellian hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable, a label that now belonged to me. I looked at the judge, a man with an austere face and tired eyes, who observed me with an expression that was not of anger, but of deep disappointment. He didn't see a wronged son. He saw a predator, an opportunist. Amelia's web was perfect. She had not only incriminated me, but had stripped me of my voice, my sanity, my very identity. My own lawyer, with a resigned sigh, stood up. Your Honor, Mr. Ricardo vehemently denies the accusations. He claims the recordings are out of context and that the will is a forgery. His words were hollow, without conviction, uttered as a formality, not as a defense. He didn't believe me. No one did. The judge cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on me. Mr. Ricardo, the court has heard the evidence. The recording, Mr. Elias's condition, the draft will. The gravity of the accusations is undeniable. The court needs more time to assess the situation, but given the circumstances and for Mr. Elias's protection, urgent measures are necessary. My heart hammered in my chest, a war drum announcing my defeat. I knew what would come next. Given the foregoing, the judge continued, his voice resonating with the authority of the law, and considering Mr. Elias's well-being, I grant temporary guardianship to Ms. Amelia, effective immediately. Furthermore, I order a complete psychiatric evaluation of Mr. Ricardo to be conducted by a court-appointed professional until the results are presented and to prevent any contact that may be harmful to Mr. Elias. Mr. Ricardo is prohibited from approaching the residence or having any type of communication with his father. The sentence fell upon me like an avalanche. Temporary guardianship for Amelia. Psychiatric evaluation for me. Forbidden to see my father. I wasn't just losing the battle, I was being erased from Elias's life, declared a threat, a madman. Miss Lucia smiled discreetly. A small nod to Amelia's lawyers, who returned it with looks of triumph. Amelia's absence was, in itself, proof of her mastery. She didn't need to be there to witness her victory. She had won. She had orchestrated the perfect downfall, transforming love into hate, trust into betrayal, and sanity into madness. I felt myself drowning in a sea of lies, every attempt to defend myself only pulling me deeper. I was a man on the edge of an abyss, pushed by an invisible force, with the echo of Amelia's and Elias's voices mixed in a parrot's throat as my last and cruelest lullaby. I was led out of the courtroom, not as a free man, but as a prisoner of a distorted reality. The world outside seemed grey, colourless, lifeless. The car driver, the same one who had brought me, now looked at me with a mixture of pity and repulsion, Amelia's mask of loyalty fully assumed. I was an outcast, a man stripped of everything, my inheritance, my reputation, my freedom, and now even my sanity. The hearing was not a search for justice. It was a formality, the execution of a sentence already pronounced. I was losing everything. And with every word uttered in that courtroom, my world, already in ruins, was pulverized into dust. The game was far from over, but I knew with chilling certainty that I had already lost the first and most crucial battle. The approaching night would bring no rest, but the darkness of a cell, be it of concrete or of my own mind. The car driver, the same one who had brought me, now looked at me through the rearview mirror with a mixture of pity and repulsion, Amelia's mask of loyalty fully assumed. He didn't need to say anything. His eyes spoke for themselves. I was the villain, the monster, and he, a mere spectator of my downfall. The car's leather seat, once a symbol of comfort, now felt like an electric chair, leading me to an uncertain but certainly grim destiny. The approaching night would bring no rest, but the darkness of a cell, be it of concrete or of my own mind. I was taken to a small rented apartment, an impersonal and cold place, far from my home, far from my father. It was a prison without bars, but with invisible walls of isolation and distrust. Every object, every shadow seemed to judge me. The silence was deafening, broken only by the echo of my own thoughts, a cacophony of anger, despair, and a pang of guilt I couldn't shake. The days that followed were a blur. The psychiatric evaluation was a farce, a macabre theater where I was the lead actor, forced to play the role of an unbalanced man. The psychiatrist, a woman with an impassive demeanor and eyes that seemed to pierce my soul, noted every word, every gesture, every sigh. I tried to explain, tried to unravel Amelia's web of lies, but my words were distorted, transformed into symptoms of paranoia and delusion. "You claim your wife orchestrated everything? That she forged documents and manipulated a parrot to incriminate you?" she asked, her voice soft but laden with skepticism. "That sounds like a movie plot, Mr. Ricardo. Don't you think?" I felt the trap closing. If I insisted on the truth, I would be deemed mad. If I remained silent, I would be deemed guilty. It was a no-win game, where Amelia's only victory was my total defeat. I saw the image of Veritas, the parrot, no longer as a messenger of truth, but as a herald of my disgrace, a puppet in the hands of a master manipulator. That dry cough, that icy whisper of water, now haunted my nightmares, a macabre soundtrack to my ruin. The psychiatrist continued, her questions like fine needles poking at my wounds. "You show intense anger when speaking of Ms. Amelia. This is understandable given the circumstances, but it can also indicate difficulty in dealing with frustrations and impulsive behavior." I wanted to scream that it was anger at a monumental injustice, not a character flaw, but I knew any outburst would be used against me. So I held back, taking deep breaths, trying to maintain a facade of calm I didn't feel. It was exhausting, a constant battle to control every fiber of my being, not to give them what they wanted. Meanwhile, news spread like wildfire. Newspapers and television, fed by anonymous sources, which I knew were Amelia's, painted a grim portrait of me. Millionaire businessman accused of elder abuse and attempted fraud. Unbalanced heir tries to seize elderly father's fortune. My reputation, built over years of hard work, was in tatters. My colleagues avoided me, my friends distanced themselves, and even the household staff, whom I considered loyal, now looked at me with the eyes of strangers. The prohibition from approaching Elias was the most painful stab. I couldn't see him, couldn't talk to him, couldn't even know how he was. Amelia had total control, and the image of Elias, fragile and alone, haunted me every moment. I imagined what she would be telling him, how she would be consolidating her version of events, turning me into the definitive villain in his already confused mind. One night, as I watched the sleeping city from the window of my apartment prison, a cold, calculating anger began to replace despair. I had lost the first battle, yes, but the war was not yet over. Amelia had stripped me of everything, but not of my mind, not of my will to fight. I needed a plan, a strategy to unmask her, to prove my innocence and rescue my father. The problem was trust. Who could I turn to? My lawyer was an accomplice. My friends had abandoned me. The law itself seemed to be against me. I was alone, but this solitude, once overwhelming, began to transform into a source of strength. If I couldn't trust anyone, I would have to trust myself. I began to revisit every detail, every word spoken in court, every interaction with Amelia. There was something I knew, a flaw in her perfect web, a loose thread I could pull. She was intelligent, but arrogance is often the downfall of the most cunning. I needed irrefutable proof, something that couldn't be distorted, something that spoke for itself without the need for my voice, which had been silenced. The game was far from over. I had lost the first and most crucial battle, but the war was just beginning. And this time, I wouldn't just be a player, I would be the strategist, the hunter. And Amelia, however victorious she felt, had not yet realized she had awakened an enemy who had nothing left to lose. The darkness of that cell, be it of concrete or of my own mind, would not consume me. It would forge me, and I would emerge, not as the madman they wanted, but as the man who would unmask the truth. The first step of my plan, the most delicate, was to reach out to old Jorge. He was a man of few words, with hands calloused by the earth, but his eyes held the silent wisdom of one who observed the world without judgment, only with the patience of nature. I knew I couldn't just call him. Amelia, with her controlling paranoia, would have tapped all the lines in the house. My approach needed to be discreet, almost invisible. I remembered that old Jorge had a habit of going to the same bakery at the same time every Tuesday to buy fresh bread for his wife. It was a small ritual, a loophole in Amelia's controlled routine. The following Tuesday, camouflaged under a cap and dark glasses, I waited for him at a safe distance. When he left the bakery with his bag of bread, I approached, keeping my voice low, almost a whisper. "Old Jorge," I said, and he turned, his eyes wide with surprise and a flicker of fear. "I need your help. It's about my father." He hesitated, looking around, visibly uncomfortable. Loyalty to his employers was a code of conduct for him, but loyalty to Elias, whom he had served for decades, was even deeper. He had known Elias since I was a child, and he knew how much my father loved me. "I know you're scared," I continued, "and I don't blame you. Amelia is dangerous, but my father is in danger. I can't enter the house, but you can. I need you to find something." I explained to him about Veritas, about the edited recording, about the certainty that Amelia had been careless. I asked him to look for anything unusual, any hidden recording device, any paper that seemed out of place. I spoke about the injustice, about the manipulation, about the cruelty Elias was suffering. I didn't promise money, I promised justice and the truth. His eyes, once full of apprehension, began to show a spark of determination. He knew Amelia. He saw her every day, and perhaps like me had noticed the cracks in her perfect facade. "I'll try, Mr. Ricardo," he said, his voice hoarse, almost inaudible. "For Mr. Elias." That night the wait was excruciating. Every minute dragged like an hour. I imagined old Jorge in the house, his silent steps, his attentive eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. The risk was immense. If Amelia caught him, he too would be destroyed. But hope, a fragile flame, began to burn within me. 2 days later, I received a call from an unknown number. It was old Jorge. His voice was tense, but there was a tone of urgency. "I found something, Mr. Ricardo, in the library, behind a painting. It looks like a digital voice recorder." My heart leaped. The library, where Amelia used to spend hours reading, but actually, I suspected, plotting. She felt safe there, isolated, without witnesses. I asked old Jorge to bring it to a safe meeting point, far from the house, far from curious eyes. When he handed me the small black device, my hands trembled. It was a simple but functional model. I connected it to my laptop, and what I heard next chilled my blood, but also ignited a fire of fury and relief. It wasn't just a recording of Amelia talking to Veritas. It was much more. There were hours of audio, Amelia in narcissistic monologues, detailing her plan, laughing at my naivety, describing how she trained Veritas with specific phrases, how she planned to disinherit Elias and incriminate me. There were even excerpts of her mocking Elias, his fragility, his confusion. "The old man is dead weight," she said in one recording. "But his fortune? Oh, that's mine." Her voice was cold, calculating, full of a cruelty I never imagined anyone could possess. She boasted of having manipulated the lawyer, of having bribed witnesses, of having planted the draft will. She spoke of Dr. Helena, the psychiatrist, with disdain, certain that the evaluation would seal my fate. It was the irrefutable proof I needed. Her arrogance, as I had predicted, had been her downfall. She recorded everything, perhaps as a personal trophy, a record of her genius. With the recordings in hand, my strategy changed. I no longer needed a lawyer who could be bought. I needed the truth. I sought out a public prosecutor, a man known for his integrity and for not being intimidated by names or fortunes. He received me with skeptical courtesy, but when Amelia's first words filled the room, the skepticism on his face gave way to an expression of shock and then indignation. The turnaround was swift and brutal. The media, which had previously vilified me, now had a new story. The true villain. Shocking recordings revealed conspiracy against heir and elderly father. Amelia was arrested. Her image as a dedicated wife and victim was shattered in a matter of hours. Dr. Helena, confronted with the evidence, had to admit the manipulation and bias of her evaluation. The prohibition of contact with Elias was immediately lifted. When I entered the house, now silent and devoid of Amelia's oppressive presence, I found my father in his room, more fragile than I remembered, but with a glimmer of recognition in his eyes when he saw me. He was confused, yes, but Amelia's presence had been a constant shadow over him. Now the shadow had dissipated. "Father," I said, kneeling beside his bed, taking his wrinkled hand. "I'm back! I'm here!" He squeezed my hand, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "Ricardo, my son." Elias's recovery was slow, but steady. With time and proper care, he began to remember, to understand fragments of the truth. He would never be the same, but peace returned to his eyes. Amelia was sentenced to a long prison term. Her empire of lies and manipulation crumbled, taking with it her reputation and her freedom. Elias's fortune was protected, and I, though still bearing the scars of battle, was vindicated. Veritas, the parrot, remained in the house. He still repeated phrases, but now, without Amelia's influence, his words were random, innocent. Sometimes he would say, "Ricardo, good boy," a phrase Elias used to use with me when I was a child. It was a bittersweet reminder of what had been lost and what had been saved. I had lost the first battle, yes, but the war had been won. Not for fortune, not for reputation, but for truth, and the protection of the only person who truly mattered. I was no longer an outcast. I was a son, and my father was safe. And that, I realized, was the only victory that truly mattered. The darkness had forged me, and I had emerged, not as the man they wanted, but as the man that truth allowed me to be.